The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
The most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Have you been watching that Netflix documentary?
Yes, and now I'm like free T-Pain and Manawatia T-Pain all day. Let's do that. Can you chuck some auto-tune?
Yeah, I can make that.
He can do that.
Kia ora tātou, this is Gone by Lunchtime. My name is Toby Manhire. No mai haere mai. Hello, Annabelle Lematha.
Tēnā koe, Toby. Tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koutou.
Tēnā tātou katoa.
We're also welcoming, before I get to Ben, Te Ai here, who's on the tools with us and has joined the spin-off team. Very glad to have him.
He's on the spin-off producer fast track to glory.
Yeah, destined for greatness.
Everybody who has produced Gone by Lunchtime has gone on to just stratospheric achievements.
It's true.
Mad Chapman, former Gone by Lunchtime producer. Mm-hmm. Now,
Governor General
Jonathan.
Now basically is like ripped out Toby's heart and eating it, and becomes the full-time spin-off editor.
That's right.
In what, October?
Jonathan's now a big rock star now.
That's
touring
right.
New Zealand and everything. Named a band after me, The Bells.
The Bells. We're going to talk about, we're going to solve COVID-19. We're going to solve hate speech. We might solve UN declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. We'll solve that. And we might solve also the National Party if we have time. COVID feels a bit like a stuck record, but it was interesting to see on Friday, Scott Morrison, who's dealing with a massive outbreak in Australia, which has seen half the country going into lockdown, announced a roadmap, which is one of the official sort of terminological staples of modern political discourse. We haven't had many rafts of measures, I've noticed lately. We've had a lot of roadmaps, a lot of rollouts, a lot of ramping up.
The thing is, we've moved past...
But not many rafts of measures.
We've moved past the blueprint stage.
Yes.
Now we've got a roadmap.
His roadmap is for the stages to emerge out of COVID-19. 4 phases, blah, 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 which include what looks at this point to be a rather optimistic aim to have the vaccine available to all Australians by the end of the year. But what it has done is it has sort of laid out a vision, I guess, or a scaffold for how Australia opens up. And I think there's growing pressure, and there will be growing pressure over the months to come in New Zealand to see something similar to that. Of course, our vaccine rollout is running slightly ahead of the schedule, but is still one of the slowest in the developed world. Do you think, Ben, that this is something that is going to grow in terms of pressure? It strikes me that, for example, just with the fact of Australia talking about, even in the medium term, opening up to Singapore, puts some pressure on the idea even of the trans-Tasman bubble. If our strategy is to be more cautious in terms of opening up, and Australia opens up, then that kind of breaks our own bubble structure.
Yeah, Nikki McDonald did a really good piece for Stuff. Was it on Friday or Saturday?
I think it was on the weekend, yeah.
And it was about the sorts of options that we've got. Because I think the really salient part of the Morrison roadmap blueprint technical drawing was the end point is learn to live with the virus. And it did not anticipate a point at which there will just be no COVID in Australia and COVID will be kept out forever. Increasingly, that's looking with, the variants that are coming up, that long-term elimination isn't practical in a global sense. It's certainly not practical while the rich world hoards all the vaccines and these variants just sort of develop like in petri dishes in developing countries. And at some point New Zealand is going to have to confront that idea, the choice between, are we a walled-off, hermetic, lost island of Atlantis in the middle of the Pacific that is COVID-free but basically disentangled from the rest of the world, or do we assume that once we've reached a certain level of the population vaccinated, that it essentially becomes like the flu? There'll be a few hundred COVID deaths per year, as we currently have with influenza, and we try and sort of carry on as normal. And I think that the government doesn't really know where they want to go on this yet. The Prime Minister has sort of talked about, we want to give ourselves as many options as possible, and I think they're just kind of delaying it for as long as possible. So I think the slow vaccine rollout doesn't actually hurt them in that respect.
Yeah, and I think Sir David Roche is chairing a group that's looking at some of those questions at the moment. But I guess the other reality, Annabelle, is that there isn't exactly a groundswell of people who are demanding to open up the borders.
You know why?
You hear from some people, but most people just aren't.
You know why? It's because the Herald did such a good job reporting on that family of gypsies that came here when we still had tourists. That now we're like, do we really want that again, but with them having COVID as well?
Yeah, we pursued a successful elimination strategy for the bad family. Now we can't lose all those.
The unruly tourists, I think that's their correct name, isn't it?
I think the delayed approaches, they can afford to do that, can't they? And it's probably wise to look and see what happens to those other countries as they open up. But like Rawiri Jansen said, I don't think that it's conscionable to be even considering it until at least 85% of the Māori population has had the chance to be vaccinated. But the other thing too is, why not be ambitious and set some goals like, let's not open up until we have no more kids living in hotels, or until we have addressed child poverty, so that we really give our tamariki the best chance of surviving in a COVID environment, if we do in fact stop pursuing an elimination strategy. But from the sounds of it, that's not what they're planning to do, is it? The elimination strategy will remain. I think that's what Chris Hipkins said on RNZ this morning.
There was the modelling that TPM did last week, Sean Hendy and co, that showed that on the basis of their modelling, 97% of New Zealanders would need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity in the face of the Delta variant, which is obviously for all practical purposes an impossibility. But I think also there's that's based on the idea that you just open up completely and you have no measures, and that herd immunity is predicated on basically having nothing, not a face mask, not a social distance. But also presumably what will happen in the real world is you will have things like opening up to green, orange, red countries in terms of their risk profiles, vaccine passports, isolation at home. These are some of the things that Morrison talked about, actually. It was kind of a weird thing for him to be doing while the COVID was kind of streaming down the streets of Sydney. But that is one of the realities, is that 14 days in a MIQ facility might turn into 7 days if you've got 2 doses of an approved vaccine, and then 7 days at home, for example. There are ways that it'll start to shift, right?
Yeah, and I think, as Annabelle said, in New Zealand there isn't this kind of real groundswell for it. Most people do actually seem pretty perfectly happy to adopt this kind of sort of little New Zealand sort of mindset, where we just live blissfully away from the rest of the world. it's not really a realistic option long term.
I think that's true, but I think also there is. I mean, just this is taking on this is only anecdata, but when I talk to people who aren't glued to the COVID updates anymore because they have life to get on with, they talk about how that trip they'd put off they're going to do next year, and I don't think you are.
The pressure is going to come from the middle classes who are missing their yearly overseas trip. In particular, where the government has really benefited and what's been really good for the sort of morale of the team of 5 million or whatever has been, we've had the photos of 30,000 people at a 660 concert. Everyone in America is masked up, stuck at home. The government, in that sense, the government's been bought a bit more time by the resurgences, thanks to Delta, especially in the UK. In the US, things actually seem to be going along pretty well in terms of their reopening up. In the UK, they seem to have basically given up, and they're sort of like, well, we'll keep vaccinating, and in the interim, a bunch of people will die from the variant. But at the same time, the images that we are getting over here will be more and more of life as normal in countries that we consider our peers. And at that point, I think the FOMO might start kicking in with particularly the voters that Labour are most interested in.
I think we need to remember too that we have an additional responsibility to our Pacifica whanaunga because New Zealand is a gateway to the Pacific. So really until they've managed to get all of their populations adequately vaccinated as well, and you only have to look at what's happening in Fiji now. Absolutely heartbreaking to see how COVID can rip through a Pacific island.
Particularly with outlying areas that are affected there where the normal sort of systems and approaches that take place in a place like New Zealand are much harder just because of the facilities and the infrastructure and outlying.
Even stuff like having enough ventilators and, all that kind of basic hospital gear that we take for granted here.
We need to, I suppose, talk as a podcast, as Gone by Lunchtime executive editorial board about this. It feels like these hate speech proposals feel like a direct attack on our ability to come together and
talk about the boomers.
Talk about you. I mean, Ben, you particularly, you like to wake up in the morning and issue as many tweets as you can attacking Karens and boomers. Seems quite targeted.
I was very disturbed by the comments by the Justice Minister in his otherwise incredibly uninformative interview on The Nation, where he sort of really refused to commit either way on examples of what would count as hate speech. And he said that, attacks on boomers, would only count as hate speech if it was done, if it was hateful commentary. Mine is all hateful.
I was going to say, that's definitely you.
Even when it seems nice, it's hateful, isn't it, if you peel all the layers back?
Oh, underneath is just an icicle of malice that informs every one of everything I do towards the elderly generation.
Even the way you're looking at me now feels like hate speech.
Like if... the MRI scan of my brain when I think of boomers is just like a Hieronymus Bosch painting, just imagining their fiery demise. And so, I'm worried about these laws, which seem to do nothing to inflict misery on boomers, but seem to target patriotic New Zealanders like me.
Annabelle, this hate speech thing has kind of become hard to get a grip on. I mean, one of the things it's important to remember is these are proposals, right? Like, it's not, for better or worse, maybe it's been badly handled, and I certainly don't think that Chris Farfo, who you mentioned, or even Jacinda Ardern were exactly paragons of clarity in terms of the way they spoke about this. But there are I think there are 5 different laws that cover this sort of territory. Post the Royal Commission, there was a into the mosque attacks in Christchurch. There was a recommendation to basically kind of elucidate the existing hate speech laws. Seems like a reasonable thing to open up a conversation on, but at the moment, personally, it just feels like it's kind of like much more heat than light.
It is a completely reasonable conversation, but as always, the boomers and the Karens are like wigging out in a major way. I think, every piece of legislation that gets passed in New Zealand has to be measured against the Bill of Rights Act. So freedom of speech is in there, so presumably it's going to continue to be protected. And while the rollout of it in terms of the, Farfoy's interview and that was obviously not stellar, it is time for us to have this conversation. Ironically, the people who love freedom of speech so much are also the same people who wig out when Meng Foon talks about racism or calls someone racist, and he's the race relations conciliator.
No reason to hate racists.
So, the whole freedom of speech argument, it's an interesting one in the New Zealand context because freedom of speech is not applied equally, because when Taika Waititi says New Zealand's racist AF, New Zealand wigs out and the Free Speech Coalition remains silent. When Renee Maihi is getting dragged off to court by Bob Jones for calling him out on an article that's riddled with hurtful, hateful remarks about Māori, she gets dragged off to court. Where's the Free Speech Coalition? Nowhere to be found. So I think there's also I think everybody needs to calm down. You're still going to get to be mean to people, but we should be looking at how we provide protection for some of our most vulnerable communities who are the subject of hateful, hurtful remarks, getting called leeches and all of that stuff. That's not designed to encourage conversation or aroha. It's just there to denigrate people, and the right to free speech doesn't exist on its own. People also have the right to live an unharassed life. So
one of the things, I think that I agree with every word of that. I would also say though that one of the things that would be useful to add into the conversation, if it's ever possible to have a proper conversation about these things, is looking at proposals and proposed legislation not in terms of the government we have now and the authorities we have now, but in terms of one down the road which may be more authoritarian, not a fully authoritarian, but just more authoritarian in tone. Like we need to imagine that these laws would also apply at a time where people who are when the state, for want of a better word, might be
I reckon
tougher.
If I was to hazard a guess, if anybody was to get charged first under any new proposed laws, it would probably be Māori, because that's how it works here. We'd probably be the first to be discriminated against, but we still need to look at the. It's still a process worth going through.
Any time you create new draconian powers or extend the powers that exist, ultimately they will end up being used on the least powerful, not the most powerful. Like that's just a pretty much ironclad law of government. It is worth having that debate, right? Because I think in the wake of Christchurch, there would be very few people who would disagree if the Prime Minister or the Justice Minister went on one of these shows and said, what we want to make illegal is somebody, putting up a YouTube video saying Jews/Muslims/Christians are vermin and should be driven out of New Zealand. We want that to be a criminal offence, right? I don't think anyone in the public would disagree with that, or some free speech sort of maximalists might disagree with it and say, on principle, we think you should be allowed to say anything, whatever. On the other hand, that's not what's happening. Instead, do you remember that it was an interview with Hana Tamaki when they first started their political party, and it might have been Lisa Rowan asked her about a policy thing, and she just sort of coquettishly looked at the camera and said, "Not telling." And that's what I think of whenever I see Ardern asked about these hate speech laws. They say, well, we're going to criminalise speech which is currently not criminal or currently not prosecuted, or we're going to raise the threshold. And then interviewers say, well, could you tell us what kind of speech you intend to criminalise? And they're just like, no. No, we won't.
But isn't that because it's going to get just because they're not being prescriptive, because the process still has to happen and they have to have the submissions and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but there's not even a draft bill. There's.
I don't think it's. The Prime Minister has said that there are certain things that Cabinet has contemplated and certain things that they don't think should be in there. For instance, political opinion, but they're still consulting on them. I don't think it's too much of an ask for them to say, in broad strokes, the kinds of speech that they want to be made a criminal offence.
Or to have been more
crazy.
clear on the things that they are absolutely clear should not be made a criminal offence. That's the thing that they could have handled much better, I think, at the outset.
But this is where it gets difficult, though, because, if you look at that guy that did the YouTube video the other day, and he was like, kill the Māori party, burn down all the maraes, death to all Māori, all of that sort of stuff. I mean, he could argue that that's political speech.
I think that would be covered by existing. That's inciting.
But that's
violence,
where it blurs, I guess, because you can't say, is all political speech out, because what if it's like, I want to kill the MP for, I don't know, whatever. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
No, but that's why I think, even though there's no way, obviously, for any kind of speech laws that you can cover every eventuality and prescribe it entirely, there will always be there will always be questions of fact for the courts to determine. But it's not crazy to just sort of ask, what is a clear-cut example of something that you think should be criminal? What's a clear-cut example of something you think should not be criminal? Farfoy has said, we want to leave it to the courts. Those will be questions for the courts. Well, the court is there to interpret Parliament's intention. That's its job, right? And to apply it to the facts in front of it. So it helps to have some idea of Parliament's intention. And the idea that I get from the government right now is that the Prime Minister and those around her sort of have this feeling that they would quite like some of these things to be a little bit more criminalised than they are right now. A lot of the speech that they find sort of distasteful or, they find hurtful or mean, but they don't want to explicitly criminalise it. They want to be pleasantly surprised by the court's interpretation, and they want to just sort of slide this kind of through on the sly and then kind of, throw the ball to the courts and then wake up one morning.
I don't get that. I don't get that impression at all. I mean, I think that what they're doing is responding to some recommendations that are in the Royal Commission report and trying to be as kind of non-committal as possible. I don't think that this is some kind of stealthy attempt to sneak in attempts to protect their own hides.
No, I just think it's a kind of passive sort of way of kind of gently easing forward the sorts of etiquette, social expectations that they prefer, in terms of, because one of the things you were talking about is, rude language, being mean about people. And this is why this debate has to be had. And unfortunately, it's a very unpleasant one because we actually have to talk about which of these rude, dehumanising, cruel, upsetting, degrading kinds of terms, we think should be criminal on the face of it. And unfortunately, it's better to have that conversation before we pass a law that we don't quite know the meaning of than afterwards. And that's going to be a really awful conversation. Yeah. Because you actually have to have people standing up and saying, well, actually, I do or I don't think that a poll about whether Laurel Hubbard should compete in the Olympics is hate speech. We at least need to nail down what Parliament thinks of those sorts of things because we know the kinds of complaints that are going to be received by the police. We know what people want to use this law for once it's passed, and we've got to have those, horrible conversations.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spinoff. You can help us keep all of The Spinoff's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama, the Ko Papa Ko Rangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Three Waters has been another reform, which you look very excited about, Annabelle. Three Waters being stormwater, wastewater, and Sylvania waters. Thank you. And drinking water.
That's going back a bit.
The proposal laid out by Nanaia Mahuta would see, I think it's 67 different sort of council territories as far as water is concerned, turned into 4 kind of regional bodies that oversee the water infrastructure. One of them would be all of the South Island and a little bit of the maybe even a little bit of the, I'm not sure, I can't remember. Anyway,
the proposal is for... The proposal is for one of the regions is the Ngaitahu Takiwā.
Oh, that's right, because there was a debate around whether or not it was ownership or governance, right? Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we remember.
I've never seen anyone look less
we're
excited
bigger and
about
more
a
important
discussion.
than everyone else, so we have a whole one.
And then kind of what the eastern seaboard of the North Island, the western seaboard, and then Auckland, basically Auckland North.
And that sounds
regions A through D.
About right. And the idea here is to try and get the councils to opt in. But we've already had I think Whangarei councils saying, no, we don't want a piece of that. Phil Goff has kind of been a bit, well, we've actually sorted our water. Thank you very much.
Have we? Aren't we still on the waiting list?
There's that. They're building that massive new pipe. They've got a big pipe.
Oh, we've got a pipe.
The central
we've got a pipe. We've got.
Well, no, the pipe's not there yet. But compared to, say, for example, there aren't pipes routinely bursting.
It sounds way cooler than just a pipe. You know, it's like a central interceptor. It's like, what is it? It's a pipe.
It's an interceptor.
It's a really fucking big pipe.
It sounds like a high-tech 80s car that fights crime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something David Hasselhoff would have driven around in.
Kit could drive down the
Kit
central
was pretty
interceptor.
mean. Kit was pretty mean, to be fair.
Ben, is this part of your overall strategy to just destroy all local body politics?
I mean, obviously, I don't have a strategy. I have a vision that comes to me in dreams on stormy nights of a better world where there is no local government. Removing water, or not so much removing, because I think the proposal is that the councils in toto will still own these entities. So they'll still own all their infrastructure
and be represented on the bodies,
and they'll be
blah,
represented
blah, blah.
by their own representatives. And I think, what is it, 50-50 iwi local council representation, but the ownership will stay with the local bodies.
Of the infrastructure.
And I think of the entity that owns the infrastructure. So when you have, when they have this new Auckland North entity, it will own all of the pipes that are currently, Water Care and Northland and that sort of thing, and then that entity will be owned by Auckland Council, Far North District Council, all those guys. But it won't be directly owned by the councils in the same way that it is now. But the more important thing is that management and governance of that infrastructure will be taken away from, directly the elected representatives who have made such a fucking dog's breakfast.
And is that a theme? Because if you look at some of the things in this term, we're talking about the removal of DHBs and one central organised National Health Service. You look at the kind of some of the national policy statements. Is that what they're called? In terms of what's being what councils being mandated to provide.
Going to put six stories
within a 15. I mean, is this a theme of the government?
Yeah, absolutely. And the RMA reforms which these very, very broad sort of non-detailed exposure drafts were released this week. And I think one of the things that the government was suggesting was that all planning for districts would be done by, I think, about sort of 12 different bodies rather than, the 67 there currently are, or 100 once you put in the regional councils. And there would be a lot more sort of, it would be centralised on a regional basis. So, absolutely, they're definitely taking steps to get rid of this sort of very highly localised resource and infrastructure responsibility that the councils have currently, which is probably a good thing in that, right now we have these tiny bodies with, I think I was on a radio panel or something with the local government New Zealand guy, and he said, we have, our 8,000 members who sit on councils and local boards. And you're like, there aren't 8,000 competent people in New Zealand who know how to do infrastructure planning and urban rural planning.
You want to have devolved grassroots democracy. Sometimes you're going to have some numpties.
Almost always, if you're basically selecting from a small town's small business people who have time to be mayor on the side of their butchery or grocer's business, they are sort of hollowing out the powers of local government, and it's not before time.
Annabelle.
I have a slightly different view to Ben, because I think that being politically accountable is a good thing, and that when someone manages your assets and does a bad job of it, that you get to vote them out afterwards, and that's obviously what's not going to happen with this one. I am a little bit concerned about what it means for hapu and iwi who might manage their own water sources if they are getting managed by a giant entity that sits way outside their takiwā, and, in terms of compliance issues, in terms of the running of infrastructure around those water sources, who becomes responsible for the upkeep of them. And I think, whenever you take or move power up and further away from communities, it tends to be problematic. So there's some concerns around that and what it'll mean for iwi, and how the people on these that will take the governance positions, are they going to be Crown appointees, or it's not really clear at the moment. And then, if it's broken up into 4 regional sort of groups, does that kind of end up opening the door for privatisation, when National comes back in, who have long wanted to privatise water under Bill Birch and all of that sort of stuff? Does it make it a little bit easier to do that? So those are some of the...
Yeah, I mean, Mahuta's ruled that out, but what you're saying is
they're not going to be in government forever,
so
the structure definitely seems like it would enable that to happen a lot more easily if there was a political desire to do so.
He Puapua continues to ripple around in the news. Willy Jackson appeared on Friday to talk about, it's not He Puapua, he said, but it's a response to the He Puapua, of course, itself was a response to New Zealand signing up to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Are we calling that, this important question, is that UNDrip? Is that how you say that out loud, or is it UNDrip?
You call it UNDrip.
You call it UNDrip.
UNDrip.
Is that?
Okay.
Okay.
Good to know.
At about Willy Jackson then sort of disappeared a bit after making the announcement. He announced a new consultation period.
I think, to be fair, he just had a mokopuna born, so
did he?
That might be where he was.
Congratulations. Is he coming on the hui to talk about
it? Probably in a couple of weeks,
okay. Yeah. There's been some criticism about the nature of the new consultation, but the idea is to speak to Māori first about what it would look like and then take it from there.
The thing that I wanted to talk about is that how it's being described by some politicians as separatism, that the idea of co-governance or treaty partnership at a governance level being separatism. And I'm just like wondering, do they understand what the word separate means? Because partnership is about including another person. Separatism is when you just want to have one group. So actually what they're proposing is separatism.
So it's about marriage rather than separation pending divorce.
Well, it's just like when one person wants to hog all the power, that's actually separatism, not including the Indigenous people.
Let's talk about another centre of severe separatism, the National Party. Seems like there's quite a fertile ground for opposition at the moment because there's a lot happening. But most of the stories that involve the National Party are kind of these incredible airport bestseller stories about what's going on in the caucus room. We had Janet Wilson, who was the head of comms for Todd Muller and then Judith Collins through the campaign, who I sort of sometimes watched her during the campaign and it looked like she was almost completely... She looked very over it, all I'm going to say. But she had some sharp words for the current approach of the National Party.
I was a little disappointed by that because I've got a lot of respect for Janet. She's a great operator.
She's amazing.
I saw the headline and I was like, she's going to spill dirt about the campaign. But then she just criticised how they're doing now, which is, we can all do that. You just look at them; they're fucking hopeless. Like I want some inside word.
I see. You were disappointed by the lack of.
I want some gory tales about the campaign trail.
Right.
I want being in the car when a vein bursts in Todd Muller's temple. I want
Yeah, you want to hear just what choice words were used when Judith Collins was in the car after the Ponsonby Road procession.
I want to, I want to tell all to be a tell all.
You want hate speech.
Not
not enough hate speech. And then your old mate, your old gaffer, Ben Thomas, Chris Finlayson, was, who's the kind of, the cerebral centre of the National Party.
That's real funny, because he was, that happened because he was talking to Florence Kerr, who's a very good member of the national correspondence team at Stuff.
Yes.
And she's doing a feature about something else that he's been involved in. And then at the end, I think she said, what do you think about what's going on in National? Obviously, he didn't have any further appointments that day because went on a tear.
Right. Yeah. I know sometimes, brands go off, but I've never seen brand destruction like I've seen in the National Party in this year or two. And he said he's got no sympathy for them. And then he said it was one of those great things. He said, put that in your article. I was like, all right, I'll put it in my article. It's a pretty. You see less of this sort of stuff than in New Zealand. Just I think because of the size of the Parliament than you do in Britain or in the US, where you get lots of, they're the kind of old guard, the big beasts of the parties, sort of looking back and derisorily over the current crew. But it's not good.
I don't know if you've seen the National Party recently, but it's not good. Is Chris Finlayson going to be hung, drawn and quartered for telling the truth, for refusing to...
Free speech.
Refusing to lie through his teeth and say things are going great with the old firm. But the other interesting thing is that, it was pretty strong language, and a lot of people got quite a lot of catharsis out of it. Again, it didn't tell you anything that you don't already know just from looking at them, right? Which is, I thought it was interesting that some people saw that as a really searing condemnation of Collins and her leadership, when in fact what I took from the published comments was, what the hell is Peter Goodfellow still doing there?
Right.
In terms of the candidate selections and... just this overwhelming sort of slop bucket of losers that they've had to contend with as either candidates or MPs that have to just be sloughed off into the street whenever their texting predilections or identity theft come to light.
Annabelle, one of the suggestions made by Claire Trevette, who's now the political editor of The Herald, in her column on the weekend, was that what the National Party needs is it's Andrew Little. Like, it needs someone who's kind of going to put in lots of engine room work and get things back to a place where somebody with more charisma can come in and then drive the thing through the ticker tape. Do you think that's the solution? What is the Annabelle Lee Mather prospectus for fixing the National Party, and what is your hourly rate?
I think Ben's already said it, like the fish rots from the head, so I think really it needs to start with Peter Goodfellow and the board.
Okay.
Had we met last time we met for this podcast? Had Muller been excised?
I don't think he had.
I don't think he had. We were still grappling with Nick Smith.
Yeah,
and we were saying, maybe Judith's just trying to get her eye in, just trying to level herself out by kneecapping someone, and now it's just turning into sort of House of 1,000 Corpses in the parliamentary opposition wing.
I mean, it is, you're in a bit of a pickle where your example setting is to excise, to decapitate the leaker, because you need to show everybody that you can't have leaks and this is how it's going to be from now on, and then every detail about that process is summarily leaked by other people in your caucus, right?
Yeah, look, I thought Claire's column was completely right. They need somebody to just, like Andrew Little did, just focus on getting the caucus working as a unit, getting them disciplined, sorting themselves out internally, rather than trying to make a grand bid to overtake Jacinda in popularity, which is not going to happen under the current leadership or any prospective leadership they have in their caucus right now. And look, there's a tiny chance that Judith's purge might do it. I mean, loyalty through a terror campaign can still be loyalty,
Can be quite a compelling proposition.
Yeah. I mean, if I were...
You want to be loved and feared, but if you can't be loved, it's better to be feared.
Yeah, if I were any of the people who have been sort of, getting glowing profile pieces about their own individual efforts, which I understand don't make the leadership particularly happy, I'd probably have a buddy system for going to the bathroom. I'd look both ways before I cross the street. Wouldn't sort of dawdle in traffic. If everybody in the National Caucus is just so terrified of Judith in beast mode, just fixing on them to end their careers, maybe that will get them all focused on the job at hand. It's not a high chance, but it's a chance.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Te Ahe. Thank you to Spin-Off members who are very much the wind beneath our wings.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Ahe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.